That's it for the news. We now have an interview with Farid Khan, who is a foreign policy commentator. We talked to him about foreign policy and human rights in the Canadian election. Today we're going to be talking foreign policy in the Canadian election. We have with us a policy commentator who's an expert analysis, Farid Khan. He commentates for City News, Global Omni, CTV and CBC. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Farid Khan.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So I'm sure you're aware that foreign policy doesn't always get the limelight in Canadian federal elections, to the point where there was an institute, it's the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, who organised an open letter to the federal party leaders. They got 40 experts, former diplomats and scholars to basically plead that the Canadian leaders make foreign policy a priority in this upcoming election. So when you talk to Canadian Muslims, what are they telling you about their priorities for the foreign policy of Canada?
Well, when it comes to foreign policy, there's a number of issues that are important for Canadian Muslims. Of course, the perennial one is the issue of Palestinians under occupied Israeli rule and the brutality that they face every day. There's also recently the issue of the Uyghurs, who are being oppressed and persecuted by the Chinese government, and with almost 1 million of them being situated in concentration camps. There's also the issue of the Rohingya, where now 4 years after the atrocities that were committed and labeled as genocide by the world in Myanmar, by the Myanmar government against the Rohingya. And of course, one of the other issues that's been around for a very long time is the issue of Kashmir and the way the Indian government is dealing with, or not dealing with, frankly, the issue of Kashmir.
All of those issues, I mean, you just said Kashmir is long-standing, but of course Palestine long-standing, the Uyghur or Rohingya may be newer, but still. What kind of scorecard would you give the current government then on having addressed those issues?
Well, I've been very personally involved on the Rohingya issue, and on that I would give them a failing grade. I would give them a failing grade on Palestine. On the issue of Kashmir, I would say incomplete. And with respect to the Uyghurs, there's been some action, but not strong enough, so I'd give them a D on that.
The Conservative government has announced, as part of its platform, I believe, for this election, that they would, if they form the government, they would move the embassy to Jerusalem, and they would move the Canadian embassy to Jerusalem. So that's obviously something that won't be supported by the Canadian Muslim community. Do you think then, if you've given those failing or D passing to the Liberal governments, do you see any light on the horizon in any of the other parties?
Well, certainly not with the Conservatives, because when they were in power under Stephen Harper, their position on unequivocal support for Israel was even more deep-seated than it was for the Liberals. And the only party that there is a glimmer of hope on the issue of Palestinians is the NDP. On the issue of the Rohingya crisis did not begin under the Liberal government when after Justin Trudeau got elected. It's been actually around for a very long time, and it was brought to the attention of the Conservatives under Stephen Harper, and the Harper government decided not to act. Of course, Kashmir has been around for a long time, and both Conservative and Liberal governments going back for decades have from time to time spoken up on it. But since the election of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India, both Conservative and Liberal governments have chosen not to anger the Indian government by raising the issue of Kashmir, even though human rights organizations have put out statements and reports saying that what Kashmiris are facing are crimes against humanity, war crimes, and some crimes that could constitute genocide.
So if we have this long history of alternating governments, Liberal and Conservative, the NDP doesn't seem to be able to get a majority enough to form the government, then how do you sort of explain, or do you try to explain, is this sacrificing human rights for the sake of trade or other strategic interests?
Most definitely. Human rights has consistently been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. It's been done by both conservative and liberal governments, and we have to take the lessons of history and see what happens if you don't address human rights. Of course, we go back to the main example being World War II, where before World War II started, Western nations were completely aware of what was going on in Nazi Germany, what was happening to Jews, and they decided not to really do anything to anger the German government. We've seen it with during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where human rights were being sacrificed. It seems that because human rights do not move votes, governments and political parties, they will mention human rights in their campaign platforms, but when it comes to actually taking the needed action, the strong, decisive action that would make a difference, they don't. And we can see that with what's happening, of course, with the situation of the two Michaels in China, where the Canadian government says it's been doing a lot, but it hasn't taken the hard decisions to make an impact.
So you mentioned that you've been personally involved with advocating, I believe, around the Rohingya issue. Do you think that it's just a matter of having more Muslims in parliament or more human rights advocates who run for office? Or is this just going to be how it is? Human rights will always be sacrificed in that way?
Well, I mean, it's certainly helpful to have Muslims in parliament. In fact, when the atrocities in Myanmar became public in September 2017, I understand that it was the Muslim caucus of the Liberal government that pressured then Deputy Prime Minister Chrysler Freeland to make a statement on that and make the government take some sort of action. However, after that statement, what we got was a lot of political platitudes, and there's been no real action taken. Certainly, it would be helpful to have human rights activists be elected to Parliament, but it depends on whether they are willing to stand up for their human rights principles and push their parties and push the government to take action or not. Ultimately, I think it's up to Canadian voters, and I think in this case Canadian Muslims, to put the pressure on the government to take action. I think we saw an example of that this past summer when there were multiple demonstrations with thousands of people coming out on the issue of what was happening to Palestinians in the latest Israeli attacks against Gaza. So I think that's what's needed. We need more people literally in the streets.
So basically rallies, letter writing, phone bank, all that kind of ordinary political activism work. You're really encouraging the Canadian Muslims to ramp it up, and not just on Palestine, but other issues too.
Well, definitely, I think grassroots activism works. I think it's had a proven track record, and certainly when you have 10,000 people showing up in a public square in Toronto, that gets a reaction. We saw since May 2020, the government was forced to take action on issues of racism after we had tens of thousands of Canadians coming out in the streets in anti-racism protests. We had a response from the Canadian government when we saw thousands of Canadians coming out with respect to the remains of the Indigenous children that were found at former residential school sites. So this sort of activism works, and Canadian Muslims need to take a page from these other activists and start getting out into the streets and becoming more active, and not being afraid to call politicians out on their lack of action on human rights issues.
Well, I think that's very encouraging. A lot of people think that that kind of rallying is a waste of time, so it's probably very good for them to hear this message from you. We have to wrap it up, but if you could just in 1 minute, we haven't mentioned Afghanistan yet. Do you think that the current government, the Liberals or whoever's next, should recognize the Taliban as the official legitimate government of Afghanistan?
I think that's a very touchy issue for Canadians, particularly given how long Canada's mission in Afghanistan was, and the fact that there were many Canadian soldiers who became victims of the Taliban. The Taliban is still designated as a terrorist organization under Canadian law. And I think that the Canadian government, whichever party is in power, will have to try and square that circle. Like, how are they going to justify establishing relations with an entity that has been designated a terrorist organization? I think it's a debate that has to be had. And Canadian Muslims can be part of that debate, and they need to demand of Canadian politicians, how are we going to try and work to help the millions of Afghans who are suddenly in a very difficult situation with the pullout of the Western nations, and now with Afghanistan being under complete Taliban control.
Thank you so much, Farid, for your insights. It was a really interesting conversation. We look forward to hearing from you either again on this show or on other shows. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
This is Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Stay safe and God bless.